Alrighty, let's get started here. So welcome everyone. Good morning or good afternoon, as the case may be. Welcome to today's webinar, where we will be highlighting some trends from the latest edition of our annual report tracking residential solar adopter income and demographic trends. This is Galen Barbos from Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. I'm joined here by my colleague, Sydney Forrester, and the two of us will be running through the material here in short order. Before getting started, though, just a few introductory items. So first, I wanted to just acknowledge our other co-authors on this report, Eric O'Shaughnessy, Naeem Dargouth, and Cristina Crespo Montañez, who all made important contributions to the document, though you'll just be hearing from Sydney and myself today. I also want to draw your attention to the web address listed on this title slide, solardemographics.lbl.gov. That is where you can go to find the report. You can also, through that link, access our online data visualization tool, which provides access to all of the data that we analyze for this report. And in addition, we also have at that website a variety of other publications that are all kind of related to this general topic area of equity and access in residential solar markets. In addition, I want to just all go through the kind of the typical bookkeeping items here, or housekeeping items. So first, the webinar is being recorded. And we will have a recording of the webinar and the slide deck up online at this web address in the next couple of days. So feel free to check that if you're interested. In addition, we'll have some time at the end of the webinar for questions and answers. And so I just encourage all of you to enter any questions into the Q&A box that you see at the bottom of your screen. I'll be compiling those as we go. And hopefully we'll have maybe 15 minutes or so at the end to get through as many of your questions as possible. So with that, let's begin. And Sydney, you can advance a couple slides. So this slide here just provides an outline of the overall report and the different topics that we cover there. We're going to actually try to get through as much of this as possible on the webinar here today. So we have a lot to get through. I'll just maybe kind of to orient you, mention that the results are split into two main sections. So section 2 addresses income-related trends for solar adopters, and then section 3 covers all of the other demographic and socioeconomic trends as kind of listed in the bullet points there. So we're going to kind of stick to that structure for the webinar as well. In terms of overview, I think some of these points may be self-evident. I'll just kind of mention a couple. The first is, just to be clear, this report focuses on on-site residential PV. And so in other words, we're not looking at community or shared solar. This is just kind of, quote unquote, rooftop residential PV. I'll talk on the next slide a little bit about the underlying data. Oh, actually, could you go back, Sydney? And also in terms of just the overview of the report, this is, this market tracking report, this annual report is very much a kind of a descriptive analysis. The objective is to identify some of the kind of key overarching trends in the market and provide some kind of factual basis for deeper analysis of those trends. And so, although throughout this deck we'll kind of offer some hypotheses about some of the factors that could be contributing to the trends that we observe, really the primary objective of this annual tracking report is just to kind of lay out that kind of factual foundation. And certainly some of the other work that we've done, which you can access through the web address here, kind of goes deeper into some of those trends if you're interested. In terms of the high-level findings, I'll just mention a few here. The first is that solar adopters are diverse, both in terms of their income and other socioeconomic characteristics. And so, throughout the report, we make comparisons between solar adopters and the broader population, and those comparisons generally rely on some kind of central tendency. And so it's just important to understand that there is a wide distribution around those kind of central tendencies. And that's a theme that we try to kind of reinforce at several points throughout the report. Secondly, solar adopters do tend to be more affluent than the general population, and also differ in terms of other demographic characteristics in somewhat predictable ways, perhaps. But those differences are narrowing over time. We have seen that in each year that we've done this report, and in this most recent edition, we see that narrowing continue. And that kind of convergence between solar adopters and the broader population really reflects kind of two somewhat distinct dynamics. One is a broadening of residential solar markets, where we're seeing residential PV increasingly adopted in new regions of the country. And then separate from that is a deepening, where within individual markets, we also see this kind of progressive kind of migration or increasing levels of adoption by lower income or less affluent households within any individual market. And we'll talk more about each of those. The data for this report, so really I think kind of one of the defining features and contributions of our work here is that we're able to pull on a very granular underlying data set. And so on the left-hand side, we describe the kind of PV address level data that we compile. And that address level data primarily comes from our annual Tracking the Sun report. And then we supplement that with some additional PV addresses that we purchase from BuildZoom and Ohm Analytics, which in turn are pulling that data mostly from building permitting data sets. And so altogether, we have about 2.9 million PV systems addresses in our data set. And we take that information and we kind of pair that with household level income and other demographic data that we purchase from Experian. So in other words, we're able to kind of append on to each PV address some corresponding household level income estimate and other demographic characteristics. And then to compare that to the broader population, we rely on census data for kind of the broader population characterization. So slide here just shows our sample and sample coverage over time. In the figure on the left, maybe I just draw your attention to the red line at the top, which shows the percentage of the total market that is included in our sample. And so you can see over time that in any given year, we're somewhere between 80 and 90% of the market covered. So very, very large fraction of the residential market is captured here. Also, just note in that left-hand figure, the blue line, which shows that California represents about half of our sample as it does the market as a whole. And so because of that, many of the national trends that we show are just for basic arithmetic reasons going to be strongly driven by trends in California. And then the figure on the right, the map just shows market coverage at the state level for systems installed in 2021. And you can see that in many states we have high levels of coverage, though there are, of course, some states in the lighter shades where our coverage is less complete. Next slide. So lastly, just a few kind of key points about the data that I want to mention or reinforce. The first is that the household income estimates, those are modeled incomes. So although Experian is drawing on a lot of underlying household level data to create those incomes, we do want to be clear that the incomes themselves are estimates at the household level. Those income estimates are sort of time stamped, more or less the current day. We purchased those income estimates in Q3 of 2022. And so the incomes represent kind of the present day incomes of these households, regardless of when they install the PV system. And so you can kind of think about them as being kind of real 2022 dollars, so that there's no need to adjust anything for inflation. The income estimates are, of course, at the household level. All of the other demographic attributes are really defined based on what Experian sort of determines to be the quote unquote primary householder, so a particular individual in the household. And then lastly, and I kind of made this point on the last slide, which is just that California obviously is a big part of our sample, it's a big part of the market, and so it heavily impacts some of the national results. So with that, Sydney, I will hand the baton to you.
Thanks, Galen. Yeah, so like Galen mentioned, I'll be going over some of our results that are split again into two sections, income and then other demographics. And this first section is split into sort of the entire data set and then different sections or subsections. So first, running through the adopters as a whole. So what you can see here is the gross annual income of households that adopt PV in 2021 really span the entire range. These are bucketed in 25K buckets. So you can see that for any individual bucket, those at like 75 to 100K are the tallest. However, there is a long right-hand tail. The far right-hand tail gets condensed by Experian into just over 250. So that's why you see that, that far right taller bar. But there are more adopters that fall to the right of 100K than to the left. So you do see that the median across all of these adopters is at $110,000. So when you start comparing that to the US population, we can do that in two different ways. We could look at all of the households in the US, which is the far left compared to the far right. And there you see there is a pretty big differential between a median of 110K, which are the adopters, and then 63K, which are all US households. Galen mentioned that these are just on-site residential solar. So these are mostly rooftop systems on owner-occupied single-family households. So if you compare to all owner-occupied households in the US, that gap narrows a little bit because you see the median go up from $63,000 to $79,000. And then again, we'll be drilling this home a lot, but half of the adopters are in California, which is a relatively higher income state. So you do see that might skew the overall results. And this sort of goes into the next slide that we have here, where when you compare solar adopters to their neighbors, it depends on how you define the neighborhood and where you set those bounds. But essentially, solar adopters are always above that. So the 100% across all of these geographic granularities are essentially 100% of the median. So you can see that even as you go from the US from the solar adopters' respective block groups, on average, the solar adopters are still, they still have incomes higher than their neighborhoods. But you'll see that as you define the comparison group from really, really large, so at the nation level, and you subsequently get more and more specific, solar adopters tend to look more like their surrounding neighbors. And here you have the blue dots, which are again owner-occupied households. So you see that gap narrow, but it follows the same curve of getting the gap narrowing as you get more specific. So just drawing your attention to the county, so that's the middle bar. When we talk about relative income in this report, we're actually talking about what percent of the county median income the solar adopter is at. And that allows us to compare incomes on a relative basis across counties in the US, whether or not those are higher or lower income counties. So taking that county level skew, so as you saw, the average was 154%, which means that on average, solar adopters have incomes that are 54% higher than their county medians. So you see that as the dotted line here. And again, you see the 100%, which would be that every solar adopter matches their county. So you can see here that in every single state, there is that positive skew. So solar adopters have incomes higher than their county median, but you see that it really does vary across all the states, the magnitude of that skew. So again, you see a difference between like 131% to 168%, with California as the highest skew that pulls that national median up, essentially. So these differences, like Yalen mentioned, we are just sort of focusing on these descriptive trends, and we don't necessarily dig super deep into the causes of these, but these could be due to things like the level of maturity of the solar market, different solar or even low to moderate income specific solar policies, programs, incentives, and then other just factors at the state level. So putting these two together, we have the absolute income, which is the line at the top, and the relative income, which is the line at the bottom. So what you see, there's a couple general trends here. The first is that they're both going down. They both have gone down over the past decade. But the second is that the lower line has sort of flattened out while the top line has decreased, which means that the relative income of solar adopters has sort of plateaued, even though the absolute income of solar adopters has gone down. So the way that we can think about this, going back to one of Galen's points about the broadening versus deepening of the market, is that when you look at relative income, we're really looking at the deepening of the markets, and the market in this case being the county. So the line would go down as solar adopters within any given county reflect incomes that are lower and lower, versus what we have on our next slide, which is the market broadening. So with the absolute income coming down, that is actually from 2016 to 2021. You saw that flattening on that bottom line, but here you do see a big increase of lower income and middle income states adopting. So really quickly, how we defined low, middle, and high was we just basically ranked all the states, all 50 states, by their median household income, and then took 3 chunks. So what you see here is that across all years, most adopters come from high income states, but that has decreased over time from 2010 to 2021. And compared to, say, like 33%, which is what each of these groups would be if at parity with the US distribution, you see instead at 59% for those high income state adopters in 2021. So adopters do still come from higher income states. However, in the past 5 years, they have started to come from low and middle income states as well. And that is partly due to Florida and Texas adopters, which are low and middle income respectively. So moving from low, middle, high income states to low, middle income households, we do look at low and moderate income share of adopters. And this is sort of like a big caveat here in this box, is that there is no universal definition of low income or moderate income. Here we have federal poverty level and area median income, which are 2 common metrics. And both of these are different than the relative income metric that we used, and different from the absolute income metric that we used, because they take into account the number of persons in that household. Then the one difference between AMI and FPL is that AMI then also accounts for the area that the household is in. So the area is usually defined at the micro or metropolitan area or the county. So for federal poverty level, there's one value for, say, a household of 3 across the entire, lower 48. So someone in Alameda County, the 200% FPL cutoff is the same for someone in Wayne County in Michigan, in a totally different state. Whereas for area median income, Alameda County in California has a higher cost of living, higher income. So that like 100% AMI is going to be higher than 100% AMI in Wayne County, Michigan. We use AMI for a lot of this report, just because, again, we're comparing households with incomes in very different places in the US. And so AMI does account for those regional differences a little bit. And then the percentages here, You can read more in the purple box, but essentially we use percentages that are also used in other income eligibility programs like the Federal Weatherization Program and the Bill Assistance LIHEAP program. And also different states have different eligibility requirements as well that oftentimes use these percentages. There are obviously exceptions. Some states use percent of state median, but again, with all that caveat said, what you can see here are a couple different things. Regardless of how you define low and moderate income, the adoption is increasing for those households across the board over the last decade. So for one example, drawing attention to area median income, we saw in 2021 that 22% of households were less than or equal to 80% of AMI. And again, that's a common metric used. It's used for the weatherization program and some other programs. And 43%, so that means an additional 21%, were between 80 and 120% of AMI. And 120 is sometimes used to sort of catch moderate income. So 80 to 120 is more moderate income households. So this is a new slide, so I'll draw attention to it here, but just for some background, with the executive order, the federal government created Justice 40 and a bunch of federal agencies either created their own definitions of disadvantaged communities or DACs, or they adopted the White House CEQ definitions. So Department of Energy, who funds this work, they had their own agency-specific definition. It's a working definition. It came out in May, so this may change, but we still decided to look at basically solar adoption in these DACs. So they use 36 criteria that include things like energy and income that we also talk about here in this report, but they also have different things like socio-economic vulnerabilities and environment and climate hazards as well. So it's not just the factors that we look at. And these trends basically look similar to what you might expect given the previous slides, where even though DAC definitions didn't exist in 2010, we just want to see what % of adopters came from these census tracts that are now considered DACs. So what you see is that it has increased over time. However, when you take just like the distribution over the course of, or over the entire US of just households in general, it's about 18% of the population falls in these DACs. However, in 2021, only 11% of adopters fell into those DACs. And when you look by state, you get a bigger, again, driving home the heterogeneity across states, you get a bigger difference. So these yellow dots are the % of households in the state that are in DACs. They all are between like 15 and 20%. And then the blue bars are the solar adopters. So typically, the solar adopters are not in DACs, or disproportionately outside of DACs, I should say. There are 5 exceptions, and I feel like we'll get questions, so I'll just mention right now. Louisiana, I think, so 60% of PV adopters happen to be in New Orleans, and in New Orleans, half of the population are in DACs. So I think that's why we get such a high percentage there. And in Pennsylvania, it's a similar story, a bit more extreme though. So I think 40% of PV adopters in our sample come from 3 cities, Philly, Pittsburgh, and Allentown. And in those 3 cities, 2/3 of the population fall into DACs. So that's also why so essentially where there are more adopters in DACs than the state distribution, it's usually because the PV adopters are concentrated in a few urban areas where there is a high percentage of households that are in DACs. So moving on to this second part of the first set of results. So we're looking into income trends still, but we're doing it by segments here. So first we have third-party ownership. So what we first want to focus on, I guess, are these blue lines. So we have host-owned and third-party ownership median income. And what you see here is that third-party owned systems are usually installed in households with lower incomes as a whole than host-owned systems, with it dipping actually on average just below $100,000 in 2021. So we actually have a colleague, Eric O'Shaughnessy, who led a report last year that essentially found that third-party ownership drives households that would not have adopted to adopt in that sort of low and moderate income range. So it leads to additional adoption. However, there is now, if I can draw attention to the orange line, there is this trend lately where third-party ownership is just less available. So fewer and fewer systems are actually accessing third-party ownership and that sort of financing. So that could potentially dampen the trend towards lower income adopters. So these topics are going to pivot pretty fast, so I'm going to move quick, but feel free to ask questions in the Q&A box. So when we look at installer level trends, they vary a lot. So in that first figure up top, we have the large installers, which means that they installed over 1,000 systems in 2021 versus smaller installers in gray. But we show the median income, the median relative income of the customers that they serve. So like you might imagine, consistent with the fact that most solar adopters are more higher income, most falls to the right of that dotted line. But some do fall to the left. And actually there are some solar installers where part of their business model or their core like target customer are actually low and moderate income customers. So they specifically serve those segments, and you see those left of the dotted line. When we look at just splitting up the adopters into low income, low moderate income, and non-low moderate income, we see that still large installers do account for over half of all LMI systems installed in 2021. This is just because of their sheer size, but also they might have more options, again, like third-party ownership that might reduce some barriers for low and moderate income adopters. So system size by income level. So as you might expect, as you go towards higher incomes, and that would be from the left to the right of each color, you see that system sizes get larger. This is because one, solar is expensive, so you can afford a bigger system. But two, a larger income might also correlate to larger square footage, which could be either more space to heat and or cool, or also a bigger roof space to actually host solar. So that could be part of the reasons as well. So just to look at the actual numbers for that first category, and these go up by 50K, you see system sizes on average at around 6 kilowatts versus 30% higher for those in the highest income bucket here at 200K and over at 8 kilowatts. So that's a pretty big difference. And then just a quick note, we do break out California when California is diverges a bit from the US as a whole, because they are 50% of the market, but California sizes are smaller. So this slide, I think this is the third year we've had it, but we've been looking at paired solar plus storage. And we said this last year, and it's true this year as well, but it is a small portion of the sample, but it is really growing. So 12% of our solar adopters did attach storage. And again, this is much higher than it was last year, which was much higher than it was the year before. So this has really increased, and we also keep on adding new states to that figure because they cross that threshold for us to report them. But basically, battery storage comes at a premium still in most places. So you do see that these adopters of solar plus storage generally have higher incomes even than just standalone solar adopters. So that is that darker gray. Just for reference, we have all across all systems on the far left, but we also have California there, and the solar plus storage incomes are about 20% higher than just standalone. There is one exception here, that's Hawaii, and that is because the solar plus storage market essentially is the solar market. So 90% of households that adopted solar had storage attached to it. And that's due to tariff changes and also some more availability of programs where you can essentially extract more value from dispatchable solar plus storage. So multifamily, and even smaller part of our sample is multifamily. So it's just 3% of 2021 adopters. This is because, again, these are systems that are mostly installed on rooftops. So a lot of these are still owner occupied, like condos. And what you see here is, I think this is the only figure where you see a bar below that dotted line. So there are some states where multifamily adopters are less than their county median income on average. And just pretty much across the board, there is variation, obviously, but these multifamily adopters do have incomes less than single family adopters. And we don't have a ton of information we don't have on these systems and on participation in different incentive programs, but it does look like there is higher participation by multifamily than single family households. So a lot of these households probably had to qualify for these programs, and that it would make sense that their incomes would also just be lower if they did qualify for an income eligibility. So moving on to the second bucket of other demographics, we have a bunch to go through, so I'm going to go through pretty quickly. These are all available on the report itself at solardemographics.lbl.gov, and also feel free to put anything in the Q&A if I'm going too fast. But in 3 slides, you'll see these bubble diagrams. So I think I'm going to pause here and just explain what we're looking at. So taking the upper left as an example, so percent of non-Hispanic Asian. So if California, for example, the California bubble were on that dotted line, it would mean that for all solar adopters, the percentage of solar adopters that had a primary householder that was Asian is the same as the fraction of households in the entire state of California where the primary householder is Asian. So if it falls to the upper left, as the California bubble does here, that means that solar adopters, the primary householder of solar adopting households, the fraction of those is actually more Asian than the US, than the state's average. So you can basically see that if it's to the upper left, it's overrepresented in solar adopters, and if it's to the lower right, it's underrepresented. So here we see that non-Hispanic Asian and non-Hispanic white adopters are overrepresented in the solar sample, whereas non-Hispanic Black and Hispanic are underrepresented. And there is sort of this variation where there are bubbles on one side or the other of the line, and each bubble is a state, and the size of the bubble corresponds with the number of households that we have in our data set. So looking at the national trend, we have 2 sort of comparison populations. One is the entire US, but again, California looks very different than the rest of the US. So we also pulled out California specifically because just in terms of the Asian and Hispanic population, it's much higher than the rest of the US. So we see here that the adopters have gotten progressively less white as time has gone on. And in recent years, that dip has essentially been filled by Hispanic adopters. And again, this is the primary householder. So we have now the language preference. So if same sort of structure for these figures. One thing that's pretty interesting. So if you look at the upper left, you can see that it's fairly, actually, I'll just toggle. So look at the upper left, you see that it's sort of straddling that dotted line. And when you compare it to the ethnicity, whereas most of the bubbles were up and to the left, what that means essentially is that language is a barrier to solar adoption. So there is an overrepresentation of ethnically Asian and Pacific Islander householders adopting, but language here is a bit of a barrier because we don't see that overrepresentation as much. And you can see that again, if you look at the lower left with the Spanish language preference, you see them tipping further into the lower right versus up here, you saw them, that these bubbles just a bit more distributed over that line. So the story's pretty interesting, I think, to look at visually, but basically language is a big barrier to solar adoption, as you might expect. And this tells the same story, but a bit more muted again. So the percent of English speaking households has gone down over time, but a bit less drastically than the ethnicity trend. And in recent years, that little dip downwards has been made up mostly by Spanish speaking household adopters. Quickly pivoting to rurality of adopters. So up and to the left means that states have adopters that are more rural than the state population as a whole, and vice versa. So at the state level, you can see that the bubbles are kind of evenly spread. We have actually 24 states that are to the upper left, so where adopters are more rural than their state averages, and 19 where adopters are less rural than their state averages. So as a whole, when you're looking at the state population, adopters are more rural than their state. And this is where I guess the call out, it's important to pay attention to what your comparison population is. So adopters on average are more rural than their state. However, in states where adopters live are actually less rural than the rest of the US. So you see that little inset that all US household lines. So that means that 19% of households in the US fall into rural areas. However, there's far less adopters that as a whole that fall into rural areas. So again, one example we could call out is California. 12% of adopters live in rural areas, which is much higher than the state average of 5%, but it's much lower than that US average of 19%. Oops, did I just, yeah. So this also is a new slide, and it was requested by some people last year, but we looked at what the differences in incomes were across urban and rural adopters, and we looked at this by state, and it there's a lot of heterogeneity, but across the board, everything is above that dotted line. So incomes skew high regardless of if you're in a rural or urban area on average in every state. The relative level of skew varies a lot, and sometimes you see that light gray, which is the non-rural or urban and suburban incomes, higher than the dark gray bar, which is the rural incomes, or vice versa. So there's not really a consistent story here, but it's just that there is a lot of heterogeneity. And moving through these pretty quickly, but we have education level. So on average, solar adopters have higher educations than the US average, but that is sort of a skew that is diminishing over time. As you can see here, the bachelor's degree or higher is that top lightest blue. So it still makes up more than the US averages, but again, it is decreasing over time. And similar with occupation. So compared to the broader US population, solar adopters are overrepresented by business and financial occupations and underrepresented by blue collar occupations. So that would be the sort of peach colors, the two peach colors versus the bottom darker gray color. But similarly, as with a lot of the story, in the past few years, there's been an uptick in blue collar adopters and a slightly downtick in the rest. So reaching conclusions, I went really quick, so please, again, feel free to ask questions. But a few things to take away. So solar adopters are heterogeneous in terms of income and demographics. Solar adopters do diverge from the US population in many ways. Again, they skew higher income, they skew more white, they skew more English preference for language, and they also skew towards certain occupations, more education, etc. They also tend to concentrate in areas outside of DACs or disadvantaged communities, which take into account socioeconomic, but also other indicators. And so these skews across the board, for the most part, are diminishing over time. So we looked at a lot of differences between 2010 and 2021, and we see that the solar adopters essentially are starting to look more and more like their neighborhood or their population. And of course, we did see that these trends do vary a lot once you dive a step deeper towards state level differences, and they would vary even more if you were to dive even deeper beyond state. So none of these is new, but these are new slides just to call attention to some related resources. Again, solardemographics.lbl.gov. You can find all of this. You'll be able to find this presentation recording, in addition to additional research from our group, some of which was referenced in this presentation. But essentially, we are able to use these data for a bunch of other studies. We also have these data available for you to use for your different work or research. And we have a solar demographics tool where you can look at these are all just income metrics, but you can look at different income trends nationally, on a state level or county level. And you can choose from a bunch of different income metrics and represent them at the state or county level here for the most recent year, which in this case is 2021, or across all years. And you can find distributions or time trends, which are linear. You can also download, so you can see on those tabs on the bottom, the filters, and then you see downloads. So you can download these data, and while the tract level data is not available for the maps, you can download tract level data as well. So if you don't find what you need, we also have ad hoc institutional support to organizations working on this topic to provide like custom data on a rolling basis or figures like that. So for this, it's most helpful, I think, for us to make sure you've gone through the report and gone through the tool and see if that might suit your needs. And if not, any sort of specific requests can be sent via this Google form. And again, all of this can be found at solardemographics.lbl.gov. And I think we have 15 minutes for Q&A, so I will stop there. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Sydney. Yeah, right on the button. Okay, good. So we've got a pretty good number of questions. So I'm really just going to kind of start from the top, and we'll try to get through as many as we can. So question number one of the general rules that I've heard is that people in mansions don't go solar much because they don't feel pain in their energy bills. They can afford to not care about the savings. Did you find any evidence for this? And I can maybe take a first crack at this, and then Sydney, you can add anything in you'd like. So I would say we didn't, I mean, obviously we're not looking at people in mansions per se here. I think one sort of limitation in our data is that the incomes get cut off above 250K. And so we don't really have great resolution in adoption trends for income levels above that threshold. But certainly up to that level, we do see, I would say, disproportionately high percentage of wealthy households adopt solar. So I think to the extent that we can address that question, I would say we find evidence of the opposite. We find evidence that wealthier households are actually more likely to adopt. But again, we don't really have the sort of the granularity to look at the super wealthy households above 250K to see if somehow the trends kind of drop off at the very upper tail.
Yeah, and we also don't have anything in our current analysis that looks at square footage. So though we do have some building characteristics through a different data set, so it could be something in the future, but we don't have any analysis currently that deals with square footage and income and solar adoption.
Yeah. Let's see, another question. So this is just a quick clarifying question. When you say all US households, are you including Hawaii or Puerto Rico? Yes to Hawaii, no to Puerto Rico. So all US states, but no US territories. Let's see, now we've got we have a comment. This is maybe more just a comment about our data sample. Since California has 1.5 million solar roofs, the maps in the Northeast seem off with large coverage. New York has only a little over 100,000 solar roofs. I guess I'm not sure if it's a question or just a sort of a comment about our sample. I would say that, in general, our coverage level in the Northeast is very high. So for most of the New England states and for New York and most of the mid-Atlantic states, we have more than 80% of the market covered in our data set, as we do in California. I think where our coverage level tends to lag a little bit is from really mostly kind of smaller markets, kind of in the middle of the country. But certainly in Texas and Florida, we've got maybe half or so of the market. I can't remember exactly the map, but I think for Texas and Florida, our coverage is not quite as strong as some of the other large markets, but certainly I think at least 50% or so.
Yeah, and in the actual report, slide 47 has the coverage for each state if you're curious to go into the report and see specific states.
Yeah, that's right. Thanks, Sydney. We have a question here referring to slide 10, asking what is the landlord-tenant incentive difference? And so I think this probably relates to kind of the split incentive problem for rentals. And that, that phenomenon has sort of been, fairly widely discussed, especially in the energy efficiency literature, and is, basically just this idea that the landlord owns the building and they're the ones who would bear the cost of installing PV or installing some energy efficiency measure, but the tenant is the one that would receive the benefit in the form of lower utility bills, assuming that the tenant pays the bills. And so because of that split incentive, investments in energy efficiency and solar are often kind of underrepresented in rental units.
Yeah, and then specific to solar, compared to energy efficiency, and this goes beyond the question, it's not landlord tenant, but it's a comment about multifamily. If there is a 4-unit where they're all condos and everyone owns the inside of their space, you actually could make your unit more energy efficient and it would benefit you. However, the roof is usually not just yours. So I think with solar, it's a bit more challenging even for owner occupied multifamily to install solar. So that's an additional barrier that isn't the traditional sort of split incentive.
Yeah, that's right. Let's see, we've got a number of questions and comments here related to system sizes in California compared to other places. So one, I guess this is maybe a comment, is I'd posit that California has more EV and storage battery owners and thus put in much larger PV systems versus other states. So I think this comment might have come in before we actually got to that slide, because as we showed, actually PV system sizes in California tend to be smaller than in other states. And that is primarily because residential consumers in California consume less electricity than households in other states as a general matter. And that's both because of the climate and also because of the state's historic investments in energy efficiency. I would say also in regards to that comment, it is true that California PV adopters are somewhat more likely to also have an electric vehicle or to invest in battery storage than PV adopters in most other states, but it still is a pretty small percentage. I think about somewhere on the order of 5% of California PV adopters last year had an electric vehicle, and about 10% of California PV adopters last year installed storage. So those percentages, they're larger than in most other states, but still a small minority of all PV adopters in California. One question, will the PowerPoint be sent? So we will be posting the webinar recording and the PowerPoint online at solardemographics.lbl.gov. And certainly you can email myself or Sydney if you'd like us to send it to you directly. Let's see, a bunch more questions about the California system sizes. So here's one on multifamily. So maybe Sydney, if you want to flip back to slide 27, I think it is. And this may be just a symptom of having gone through the material fast. But the question is, can you explain more how so much of the solar adopter median relative income is multifamily if only 3% of systems were installed on multifamily buildings?
Okay, yeah, so these bars are the relative income, the median relative income of all of the solar adopters in these categories. So for example, that first bar is Arizona. So that darker bar is the median relative income across all of the multifamily adopters in Arizona. So each adopter basically gets a relative income. So what percentage of your county median are you at? And then those all get essentially aggregated together and we take the median out. So we do that for the multifamily and then we compare it to the same thing for single family for each state.
Great, thanks, Sydney. Next question. So actually two questions from this person. So on slide 36, if you want to flip to that, it says, not every state is listed on the x-axis. Was this purely for presentation purposes, or the states are not listed don't have enough data? So it's the latter. And I can't recall, Sydney, what exactly our threshold is, but in order to plot any individual state in a graphic, we had some minimum sample size and minimum market coverage threshold that had to be met.
Yeah, and they're pretty low. So I think we try to include as much as we can, but it might be like 30 systems or something like that.
Yeah, and 10% of the market or something like that.
Yeah, so we're missing Alaska, for example. We only have a couple of data points there.
Yeah. And another question, this is on the language slide, and actually we have a couple questions on that slide. This question, I'm interested to know how the languages were chosen to group. English and Spanish are languages, but Asian PI is not.
Yeah.
Was this also, yeah, so you can elaborate on that, Sydney.
So we get household level data from Experian, but we want to be able to compare it to the general population. And that is done through the American Community Survey done through the census. So we actually went through and aggregated these languages, the same thing actually for everything, occupation, ethnicity. We group it to match the ACS variable so we can do comparisons. So in other words, these categories here are the ones the ACS uses. Yeah, so we use the Census Bureau groupings. So we don't actually choose these groupings ourselves. Okay, great, thanks. Also related to language, question, were you able to compare language and income? I'm curious as to if language is definitely the barrier, or if non-English speaking households tend to be lower income, and thus income could be the primary barrier. I think we didn't include our slide on further questions that we have. I think that is a further question that we have identified and are also curious to know. Yeah, no, that's a great question. Okay, and we've got about 5 minutes left, so we'll try to get through as many of the remaining questions as we can. Is that rate of
diminishing difference between adopters and non-adopters, for example, race, slowing. The graphs might have been linear in the past, but it looks like things are slowly and eventually will settle with a permanent gap. So kind of is the trend sort of tapering off?
I mean, just visually, I think it depends. Like, is it tapering for Asian households based on this? It looks like it. Is it tapering for Hispanic households? No, it looks like it is definitely increasing, and the white householders are decreasing. There have been like periods of years where I think it does look pretty flat. And I think this is due, again, this is sort of like the US snapshot. So I think it's due to a bunch of different factors that we don't necessarily pull out very, very well in this broad analysis.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And there's just in general, there's just some volatility in the data, and so it can take a few years before we could really confirm that some sort of flattening has happened, or if it's just sort of a temporary lull that may just be an artifact of our data, or may just be some kind of sort of temporary feature of the market.
And these are also estimates from Experian. We do find the same trend, though, if we just use, for example, block group information. So that wouldn't be just one household, but it's like the pretty close spatial area of the household. So we find that this is consistent, but more specific than the trends of just like where, what are these neighborhoods that are adopting, I guess.
Next question, is there anything in this study about the effects of various net metering policies on solar adoption? So this is a question that we've kind of thought about a little bit. We certainly did not address this within the current study. We've I think internally discussed maybe investigating this in some sort of separate follow-on analysis. I think if you go into our online data visualization tool, you can look at the temporal trends for individual states or counties. And so it's possible if anybody wants to, if there's a particular state or utility that has made some major change to its net metering policy, you can go into the data and at least see kind of whether there's some correlation with those policy changes and any changes in kind of the pace of kind of convergence. I will say, we've done this a little bit and looked at Hawaii, for example, which started phasing out its net metering policies about 5 years ago. And at least in Hawaii, we did sort of see that the gap has basically been pretty flat since then. So that's not to say that there's a definite causation, but there is a correlation, at least that we've observed there in Hawaii. How, if at all, are any trends in this analysis impacted by COVID-19? So we didn't really look at this. I mean, I think, obviously we've got 2020 and 2021 here. I don't know, Sydney, if you have any specific insights, but I think in general, I would say that, those years seem to just show a continuation of the trends that we've seen in previous years. And so no obvious effect in terms of COVID-19.
Yeah, and we don't really isolate any individual impacts, because I think that over the last few years as well, there's been more attention drawn to things like decarbonization and energy equity and stuff. So there are various sort of like positive and negative factors that are sometimes like they cover big regions, and sometimes they're really specific to very, very specific regions, I guess. So it's hard to tell.
Alrighty, well, we are now at the top of the hour, so we need to bid farewell. I I apologize for those whose questions we didn't get a chance to answer. Certainly, you can feel free to follow up with us if you like. And I would just end by first thanking all of you for joining and for your questions, and noting again that you can find the report, the data visualization tool, the webinar recording, other related reports and presentations, all of that at solardemographics.lbl.gov. So again, thanks for joining us today, and we will see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you.